She rejected the dream doctor everyone desired. He was secretly a Korean mafia boss. 3 women had approached Dr. Kang Min-kyu that month alone. The first was a pharmaceutical sales rep who had arranged an entire private dinner under the pretense of discussing hospital procurement. She had worn red. She had smiled the way women smile when they have decided they want something. Min-kyu ate the meal, answered her questions with flawless professionalism, and at the end of the evening thanked her for her time. She sat alone with the bill and a complimentary wine she hadn't ordered. The second was a junior resident who had slipped a folded note into the pocket of his white coat during morning rounds. He found it between patients. He read it without changing his expression, refolded it with the same precision he used to close an incision, and placed it in the bin beside the hand sanitizer station. He didn't mention it. Not to her. Not to anyone. She transferred to a different wing 2 weeks later and told herself it was for career reasons. The third was the wealthy donor's daughter, a woman who had attended 3 consecutive hospital galas specifically to get close to him. She had cornered him after the third one, her champagne glass still in hand, her voice steady with the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by anything that mattered. "I want to know you," she said. "Outside of this building. Outside of all of this. Just you." Min-kyu looked at her the way he looked at everything. Steady, unreadable, unhurried. "I'm not available in the way you're hoping," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." She laughed because she thought he was being modest. Then she realized he wasn't. She set her glass down on a passing waiter's tray and left without another word. Min-kyu stood at the edge of the gala and waited. He was very good at waiting. He waited for something to stir. Regret, perhaps, or the faint pull of what could have been. Some distant version of longing. Nothing moved. It never moved. In 34 years of living, Kang Min-kyu had perfected the performance of a complete man. He was celebrated in operating theaters and feared in dockside warehouses. He carried 2 worlds in the same body with no visible effort. But the one territory no one had ever successfully entered, not a donor's daughter, not a determined resident, not a woman in red, was the part of him that was simply his. He had accepted this the way you accept a scar. It was clean. It was permanent. It required no explanation. Which is why, when exactly 6 days after the gala, Dr. Kang Min-kyu stopped walking in the middle of a trauma corridor. Stopped the way a man stops when something pulls at him from a direction he didn't know existed. Every nurse, every intern, every administrator within eyeline felt it before they understood it. They watched him go still. They watched his eyes fix on something. And then they watched the most desired, most untouchable man
Doctor,
in
please
Mirai
stand
Medical
behind the
Center
line.
walk
Oh,
directly
right. Sorry
toward the
about
new
that.
intake
Thank you.
nurse
We need to
like
maintain
a man who had
distance.
no
Understood.
choice in the matter at all. She was standing at the corridor boundary, clipboard in hand, not looking at him. He opened his mouth, and she said, without glancing up, "Stand behind the line like everyone else." The intern beside him stopped breathing. Min-kyu did not move. He did not correct her. He did not introduce himself. He simply stared at her, for 1 second longer than any person had ever made him stare at anything, and felt, for the first time in 34 years, a flicker. Now, before we go any further, if you are someone who believes that the most dangerous love stories aren't the ones that begin with fireworks, but the ones that begin with a woman who doesn't flinch, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And drop a comment below telling me, have you ever said no to someone who turned out to be exactly what you needed? Because that is precisely what this story is about. And I promise you, by the time it ends, you will not be the same person who pressed play. Let's begin. It had started 6 days earlier. A Monday, 7:48 in the morning. Mirai Medical Center's intake corridor was the kind of place that swallowed people whole on good days. On rainy ones, it
You
was
look
something
exhausted.
worse.
It's been a long
Families
shift.
arrived with fear
Let's get some
already in
coffee.
their eyes.
Yeah, I need it.
Patients came in mid-collapse, mid-scream, mid-prayer. The intake unit didn't ask you to be ready. It only asked you to move. Min-kyu was cutting through on his way to a pre-op briefing when something slowed his feet outside the main triage bay. He had walked that corridor 10,000 times. He had never once paused. But that morning, something stopped him at the door. Inside, a woman he had never seen before was managing what should have been an unmanageable situation. A patient's family had broken past the barrier. A mother, screaming. trying to reach her son who was being stabilized behind a curtain. 2 junior nurses had frozen. A security guard was hovering, unsure. The new nurse stepped directly into the center of it. Not loudly, not with force. She placed herself between the woman and the curtain, made eye contact, and said something low enough that Min-kyu couldn't hear it through the glass. But whatever it was, the mother's body changed. Her shoulders dropped. Her hands unclenched. She let herself be guided to a chair. Then the nurse turned back to her station, picked up her clipboard, and continued working as though the crisis had simply been a minor interruption in an otherwise ordinary morning. Min-kyu stood at that door for a moment he could not entirely account for. He had seen composure before. He was composure. But what he had just witnessed wasn't the composure of training or discipline. It was the composure of someone who had already survived the worst, and decided quietly that nothing in a hospital hallway was going to rattle what remained. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she had come from. He only knew, with a certainty that sat in his chest like a new kind of weight, that he was going to find out. Leila had packed her entire life into one suitcase and a carry-on. Not because she owned so little, because she had learned, after Daeho, to stop accumulating things that could be taken. She arrived at Mirai Medical Center on a Monday. The rain came sideways. Her transfer papers were slightly damp by the time she reached the administrative desk, and the woman processing her credentials gave her the particular look that said, "Jeju Island. Intake unit. You must not know what you're walking into." Leila knew exactly what she was walking into. She had requested it. The intake unit at Mirai was organized chaos dressed in fluorescent lighting. By 8:15 on her first morning, Leila had redirected a misfiled patient, restocked 2 empty crash carts that had no business being empty, and talked a man in his 50s out of leaving before his blood work came back. By 8:40, she had learned which nurses ran tight and which ones stalled under pressure. By 9 o'clock, she had quietly adjusted the triage board in a way that nobody asked her to and that everyone immediately benefited from. She didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. This was her language, the controlled flood of human emergency. Screaming families, broken systems, the particular violence of a place where bad news arrived faster than comfort. Other nurses flinched at the noise. Leila moved through it like someone who had already been hollowed out by worse, and rebuilt herself around what remained. Daeho had been worse. She didn't let herself think his name often. But on mornings like this one, when she was somewhere new and deliberately alone, it sometimes surfaced without permission. He had been charming the way certain men are charming, completely, and with great intention. He had talked about their future the way other people talk about things they can already see. A house, a wedding, a life built together. She had believed him, not naively. She had considered herself a careful woman, a practical woman. She had believed him because he had given her every reason to. Then he was gone. Her savings with him. Her trust in anything that wore a convincing face. Men with power always lie, she had told her sister afterward, the night she finally cried. Her sister had argued. Leila had not changed her position. She hadn't changed it since. She first heard Dr. Kang Min-kyu's name the way she heard most things in a new hospital, through the low current of other people's reverence. That's his wing. The elite surgical floor. Don't bother, he doesn't notice anyone. He's untouchable. Brilliant. Perfect. She filed it away with the same interest she gave hospital gossip generally. None. She had no reason to look up. So she didn't. He appeared in her corridor on the 3rd day. Not loudly. Not in any way she could have immediately objected to. He was simply there, standing near the far wall with a patient file, drinking black coffee like a man who had nowhere more important to be, which she knew even then was a performance. Men like that always had somewhere more important to be. She ignored him. On the 4th day he was there again. On the 5th she noticed he was watching her work. Not with the loose curiosity of someone with time to waste, but with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a system that was confusing him. She still didn't speak to him. The mother came on the 6th day. A patient's family member. Older, terrified. The kind of grief-soaked rage that arrives when fear has nowhere else to go. She came at Leila during triage, voice breaking into a scream, hands gesturing the way hands do when words have stopped being enough. Leila didn't step back. She planted her feet, kept her voice below the woman's volume, and held the eye contact that most people in that corridor had already looked away from. The woman screamed louder. Then a voice came from behind Leila. Quiet, but with a weight that seemed to lower the temperature in the room. Mom. One word. The mother stopped. Min-kyu said nothing further. He simply looked at her with those glass-polished eyes until the woman exhaled, pressed her hands to her face, and allowed herself to be guided to a chair. The corridor resumed. Leila breathed. She was still looking at the triage board when she heard him beside her. You weren't afraid, he said. She kept writing. Of her or of you? A pause. The kind that had texture. She finally looked at him. Tall. Perfectly composed. A man who was clearly not accustomed to questions that redirected the weight back onto him. He didn't answer. She turned back to the board. Thank you for stepping in, she said plainly. No softness in it. No invitation. He stood there for one moment longer than was necessary. Then he left. Min-kyu walked the length of the surgical corridor before he stopped. He turned the exchange over in his mind the way he turned complications over in surgery. Looking for the mechanism, the cause, the point at which the unexpected had entered. Every person in that hospital responded to his presence with some variation of the same thing. Deference, admiration, nerves, performance. Even the ones who tried to hide it. He had learned to read it so automatically he barely noticed it anymore. She had given him none of it. Not defiance. That would have been its own kind of attention. She had simply looked through him, spoken to him with the same measured tone she might use on anyone at all, as though his name meant nothing and his presence changed nothing, and the gap between his world and hers was a fact she had already processed and put down. He stood in the corridor and recognized, with the uncomfortable clarity of a man who trusted precise information, that she did not fear him. And for the first time in longer than he could account for, that frightened him. The call came at 11:47 p.m. Multi-vehicle collision on the expressway. 17 casualties confirmed. More incoming. All available personnel to emergency stations. Leila was already pulling on her second glove before the announcement finished. The next 6 hours did not feel like hours. They felt like a single sustained breath. The kind you hold through something terrible and only release when the worst has passed. When the last gurney has been stabilized and the last family has been moved to a quieter corridor to receive news that would change the shape of their lives forever. She didn't see Min-kyu arrive. One moment the bay was short-staffed and barely holding, and the next he was simply there, on the opposite side of a trauma table, already gloved, already focused, already inside the emergency the way experienced surgeons enter emergencies. Completely and without announcement. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. They worked. It started with a man in his 40s, blunt abdominal trauma, unstable pressure, a chest that was making sounds it had no business making. Min-kyu called for instruments with the same quiet authority she had noted in the corridor, and Leila moved to support without being asked, because the need was obvious and she did not require instruction to see what was obvious. He glanced across the table once. She was already anticipating the next step. He returned to the patient. 3 stations down, a teenage boy. She was managing his airway when his pressure dropped without warning. The kind of drop that required immediate reprioritization and a clear head. She called it aloud. Min-kyu heard it from across the room, assessed the situation in one look, and redirected a junior resident to her station with a single gesture that was faster and more efficient than any verbal order would have been. The boy stabilized. She moved to the next. This was the rhythm they fell into, not designed, not discussed, not the result of any familiarity between them. It was something older than familiarity. It was the recognition of a shared standard, a shared threshold for what counted as acceptable and what did not, a shared refusal to let the chaos set the pace when a steadier pace was possible. When she needed something, she said it once. He heard it the first time. When he moved, she understood why before he explained. They did not speak about anything personal. They did not speak about anything at all except the work, and even then only when silence was insufficient. By the 3rd hour, even those words had reduced to gestures, to positioning, to the small physical grammar of 2 people who had stopped wasting motion. At one point, she reached for suction and his hand was already there, already offering it, without either of them having looked up. Neither acknowledged it. By 5:40 a.m., it was over. The bay settled into the particular quiet that follows a long emergency. Equipment pushed back, voices lower, the fluorescent lights unchanged but somehow less aggressive. People moved slowly. Someone laughed once, softly, the way people laugh when they have survived something and need to confirm they are still capable of it. Leila found a chair against the far wall and sat down in it completely. Not gracefully. The way a person sits when they have been upright for 6 hours and their body simply decides the conversation is finished. She stared at the middle distance. A moment later, Min-kyu sat down 2 feet from her. Not close. Not far. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at the same middle distance, as though they had agreed on it as a point of focus. Neither spoke. Several minutes passed. Then Leila said, without looking at him, "You're efficient. Flat. Factual." The tone she used for things that were simply true and required no decoration. Min-kyu was quiet for a moment. "You're brave," he said. "Also flat. Also factual." She turned her head and looked at him, not with the careful, evaluating look she had given him in the corridor, but with something less guarded than that. Something that had been worn down to its simpler form by 6 hours of shared exhaustion. She smiled. It was small, brief, the kind of smile that arrives before a person has decided whether to allow it. But it arrived. The cafeteria was half empty at that hour. The food was what hospital food always was at dawn. Functional, graceless, kept warm by equipment that had been running since the previous afternoon. Leila set her tray down at a table near the window and sat facing the gray morning outside. Min-kyu appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision. She waited for him to pass. He didn't pass. "Eat with me," he said. She looked up. "I don't date doctors. I'm not asking for a date." "Then what are you asking for?" A pause. Brief. Like a man selecting the most accurate word. "A seat." She studied him for a moment, the flatness of it, the absence of performance in it. No charm diploid. No angle she could immediately identify. Just a man who had worked beside her for 6 hours and was, apparently, not yet finished being near her. She looked back at her food. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He didn't attempt conversation. He didn't fill the silence with pleasantries or questions or any of the social machinery that people use to make themselves known to someone new. He simply ate and occasionally looked out the same window she was looking out of, and was quiet in a way that did not ask anything of her. She noticed this. She didn't comment on it. But somewhere between the first minute and the last, she stopped waiting for whatever he was going to want from her. He didn't seem to want anything. Across the table, Min-kyu watched the gray light shift against the window and felt something settle in his chest. Unfamiliar enough that he took a moment to identify it. Not desire. Not the sharp pull of wanting something he didn't have. Something slower than that. Something that did not demand resolution. Peace. He did not trust it. But he recognized it. And for a man who had lived in 2 worlds simultaneously for most of his adult life, neither of which had ever been quiet, the feeling sat in him like something he had not known he had been missing until it was, without warning, simply there. The hospital released him at 9 p.m. To anyone watching, Dr. Kang Min-kyu left Mirai Medical Center the way he always left. Unhurried, coat folded over one arm, the particular composure of a man whose internal temperature never visibly changed. He nodded to the night security guard. He took the stairs instead of the elevator. He walked to the lower parking structure and got into a black car that was not the one registered under his name. The driver did not greet him. Min-kyu did not require greeting. The warehouse sat at the edge of Busan's port district, unremarkable from the outside, the kind of building that existed in the peripheral vision of a city and was never looked at directly. Inside, 12 men were waiting. They stood when he entered. Not the polite standing of a meeting, the other kind. Min-kyu moved through the room without acknowledging it, the way a man moves through a space that has always oriented itself around him. He took his position at the head of the table, and the room resettled into its correct order. Jung-ho was already beside him before he sat down. Jung-ho had been beside him for 11 years. He was precise, loyal, and entirely without sentimentality. Qualities Min-kyu had always respected and occasionally found exhausting. The Incheon route needs a decision, Jung-ho said. And there's something else. Min-kyu looked at him. You've been seen, Jung-ho said. At the hospital. With the same woman. Repeatedly. Silence. People notice patterns, Jung-ho continued. His voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man delivering a warning he knows will not be welcomed. Attachments create exposure. Exposure creates enemies. You've spent 10 years making sure no one outside this room knows what you are. One nurse from Jeju Island shouldn't be the thing that changes that. Min-kyu was quiet for a moment. Handle the Incheon route, he said. The other matter is not a matter. Jung-ho said nothing further. He had known Min-kyu long enough to recognize the particular stillness that meant a conversation was finished. He did not agree with it, but he recognized it. Leila noticed the car on a Tuesday, black, parked across from her apartment building when she left in the morning. Present again when she returned at night. A different plate on the second day, but the same model, the same distance, the same quality of stillness that didn't belong to ordinary street parking. She told herself it was coincidence. She almost believed it. Dae-ho appeared on a Thursday. She came around the corner of the intake corridor and he was simply there, older looking than she remembered, but wearing the same expression she had spent 18 months trying to forget. The one that arranged itself into something resembling remorse while the eyes remained elsewhere. Leila, he said, I just need to talk. There's nothing to talk about. I owe you an explanation, and I just need a little time to sort something out. Financially, she felt the specific exhaustion of a person being asked to absorb, again, the consequences of someone else's choices. No, she said and moved past him. He caught her wrist, not violently, but without permission, and with the casual certainty of a man who had held that wrist before and expected the memory of it to still mean something. Let go, she said quietly. He didn't immediately. Then a voice came from down the corridor. Remove your hand. 3 words. The temperature in the hallway changed. Dae-ho turned. Min-kyu was standing 10 feet away, not moving toward them, not raising his voice. He was simply looking at Dae-ho with an expression that communicated with absolute efficiency that the next few seconds were the most important decision Dae-ho would make that day. Dae-ho released her wrist. He left without speaking. Leila stood still for a moment. Then she exhaled and turned to face Min-kyu. Thank you, she said, the same plainness she had used before, but underneath it something tighter. Min-kyu nodded. She looked at him, really looked the way she had been careful not to. I don't trust men who live double lives, she said. I've learned that one the hard way. Something moved across Min-kyu's face. Not guilt exactly. Faster than guilt. The involuntary flinch of a person who has been named without being seen, the particular exposure of an accurate sentence delivered by someone who didn't know how accurate it was. He controlled it in under a second. That's a reasonable position, he said. She studied him a moment longer. Then she nodded and walked back to her station. That night, Leila stood at her apartment window and looked down at the street. The black car was there again. She thought about the way Min-kyu had appeared in that corridor. Not passing through. Not coincidentally nearby. There. Positioned. As though he had known. She thought about Jung-ho. A name she had heard murmured once when Min-kyu took a phone call near the stairwell and stepped away faster than necessary. She thought about the way certain men in the hospital lowered their voices when Min-kyu passed. A deference that went beyond professional respect. She pulled on her jacket. She told herself she was not following him out of anything as simple as jealousy or suspicion. She had no claim on him. She wanted no claim on him. But the black car had been outside her building for 4 days. And the only person who had appeared every single time she needed one was a man she did not fully understand. That, she decided, was reason enough. She followed him. She almost turned back twice. The first time was at the bottom of her building stairwell, where the sensible part of her brain made a final, reasonable argument. This is not your business, you owe him nothing, go back upstairs. The second was at the edge of the Port District, where the streets narrowed and the lighting became sparse, and the city felt less like a city and more like a place that had agreed to forget itself after dark. She kept walking. The black car had led her here, not directly, not obviously, but she had memorized the route it took on the 2 evenings she had watched it from her window, and she followed that memory now through the rain until the warehouse appeared at the end of a service road. Low, wide, and lit from within by something that leaked pale yellow through the gaps in the paneling. She stopped outside. She listened. Voices. Low. More than one. The specific cadence of men reporting to someone rather than conversing with someone. She moved to the side door, which had been left open 2 inches against the humidity, and looked through. 12 men. Maybe more. They were standing in the configuration of people who do not sit in the presence of the person at the head of the room. Some had their hands clasped. Some were very still in the way that men are still when stillness is a form of respect. At the front of the room, with his back partially to her, was Min-kyu. He was not wearing his hospital coat. He was in dark clothes she had never seen on him, and he stood with a different posture, not the careful professional composure of the surgical floor, but something older and more absolute. The room organized itself around him the way rooms organize themselves around a particular kind of authority. One of the men said something she couldn't fully hear. Then another voice, closer to the door, "As the chairman directs." And a third, "Yes, boss." Leila went very still. Min-kyu turned. He saw her in the doorway. The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. Then he said something in a low voice to the man beside him. Jung-ho, she would later understand, and the room began to empty with quiet efficiency. Men filed past her without making eye contact. The door opened wider, and then it was only the 2 of them in a warehouse by the docks, with rain on the roof and the truth sitting between them like something that had always been there and had simply been waiting for the right moment to take up its full space. "How long?" she said. "Not a question exactly." "Since I was 19, he said. "My father built it. I inherited it the way you inherit a language, without being asked, before you're old enough to understand what it costs." "The syndicate." "Yes. The men at the hospital who watch you. The car outside my building." He didn't deny it. "I needed to know you were safe. From the enemies you made." Her voice was level. That was the most frightening part, her own levelness. "The surgeries. The hospital. All of it real?" "Yes. Everything at Mirai is real. But you come here at night and men kneel." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The rain was louder now. Somewhere outside, a cargo vessel sounded its horn across the water. Low and prolonged, like a warning issued too late. "You're a lie in a white coat," she said. She said it without cruelty. That was what made it land the way it did, not as an attack but as a verdict. Considered, accurate, and final. Min-kyu said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would have been more honest than his silence. She submitted her transfer request at 7 a.m. By noon, it was processed. By the end of the day, her locker was cleared, her access badge returned, her name removed from the intake rotation board. The unit absorbed her absence the way emergency units absorb all losses, quickly, practically, without ceremony. Min-kyu received no formal notification. He heard it through the hospital the way he heard everything he wasn't meant to know, immediately and in full. He did not go after her. He sat in his office for a long time with a patient file open in front of him that he did not read. Then he made a phone call, not to Jung-ho, to a lawyer. The dismantling began without announcement. Routes suspended. Accounts frozen. 3 distribution points closed within the first week. Their operations rerouted into legitimate logistics companies that Min-kyu had been building quietly in the background for 2 years. Not in anticipation of this, but as a contingency he had never expected to actually use. Jung-ho came to him on the 4th day. "You're moving too fast," he said. "Closing these routes creates vacuums. Vacuums attract people who are less careful than we were. The men we kept in check. They'll see this as an opening." "Let them see it," Min-kyu said. "They won't just fill the space," Jung-ho said, his voice dropping to the register he used when he needed to be heard precisely. "They'll come for what you're protecting. They'll come for the reason you're doing this." Min-kyu looked at him. Jung-ho held the eye contact. They already know her name. The man who delivered that information to the rival network did so on a Friday evening, in a parking structure 3 kilometers from Mirai Medical Center. He was not someone Min-kyu would have suspected. He was not someone anyone would have suspected, which was, of course, the point. The message he passed was simple. Chairman Kang is walking away from the table. He has a reason. Her name is Leila. She heard the footsteps at the corner of her building. Not immediately. She was 3 steps past the point where noticing would have been easy before something in her body registered what her mind was still processing. The particular rhythm of steps that aren't going anywhere, that are following the rhythm of her steps. She didn't run. She didn't turn around. She walked faster. The gap closed anyway. There were 2 of them. She understood this when the first one stepped in front of her, materializing from the building's shadow with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before and found it unremarkable, and the second one stopped behind her, cutting the geometry of her exit down to nothing. The one in front was unhurried. That was the detail that frightened her most. Not aggression. Patience. "We don't want to hurt you," he said, in the tone of someone for whom that distinction had very narrow meaning. "We just want to send a message." She said nothing. "Your doctor," he continued, "belongs to us. Whatever he's told you, whatever he's made you believe, he has obligations that exist before you. He needs to be reminded of that." A pause. "So do you." He reached for her. Then something changed in the air behind her. A shift in pressure, a sudden absence of sound from the direction of the second man, and the one in front of her registered it in his eyes before she understood what she was seeing. Min-kyu came from the left. She didn't see everything that happened. It was fast, and it was not performed for observation, and it was nothing like the controlled precision of a surgical suite. It was efficient in a different way entirely, the efficiency of someone removing a problem by the most direct route available. The second man did not get up. The first one ran 4 steps before Min-kyu said something. One word, low enough that Leila couldn't hear it, and the man stopped, turned, and sat down on the pavement with the deliberate compliance of someone who had just reassessed his situation completely. Min-kyu looked at her across the space between them. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. He held her gaze for 1 moment, checking, not asking, then took out his phone. She didn't ask him to come upstairs. He came upstairs anyway, and she didn't stop him, and she told herself it was because her hands were shaking slightly and she wanted them to stop before she was alone. She put the kettle on. She kept her back to the room. Then she turned around and saw him at her kitchen counter. One hand braced against the edge, his jacket pushed back. The dark stain at his side that he had been holding himself carefully against showing. "You're bleeding," she said. "It's manageable." "That's not what I asked." She found her first aid kit without speaking further, and he sat down at her kitchen table without being asked, which told her the wound was worse than manageable. She worked in silence for a moment, the way she worked in triage, efficiently without flinching. "You came anyway," she said quietly. Not an accusation. More like something she needed to say aloud to confirm it was true. "Yes," he said. "Jung-ho warned you this would happen." "Yes." She secured the dressing. She didn't move away. "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone selecting the most honest answer from several available ones. "I promised myself," he said, "that I would never use fear to keep you close to me. Not my reputation. Not what I'm capable of. Not what I know about protecting people." A pause. "Only choice. Yours. Every time." She looked at him. He looked back without adjusting his expression into anything more comfortable. "You could have stayed away," she said. "Let me handle it." "No," he said simply. "I couldn't." The kettle reached its temperature and clicked off. Neither of them moved toward it. "You're dangerous," she said. "Yes." "And you saved me." "Yes." The rain had started again outside, the same steady rain that had been present at every significant moment between them, as though the city had a recurring habit of bearing witness. She looked at the window and then back at him. "I meant what I said at the warehouse," she said. "I'm not walking back from that." "I know." "Then stop," she said. "Stop living in 2 worlds. Not for me. For whatever is left of you that belongs to neither of them. She held his gaze. Because I won't live in either one. And I don't think you want me to. Min-kyu sat with that for a long moment. The wound at his side pulled when he breathed. The kitchen light was too bright. Her hands were still on the edge of the table, close to his, not touching. He thought about the warehouse, the men who kneeled, the 11 years of machinery he had kept running because dismantling it had never felt like a real option, because there had never been anything on the other side of it worth walking toward. He looked at her hands. He thought, there is now. He called Young-ho at 2 a.m. Young-ho answered on the second ring, which meant he had not been sleeping, which meant he already knew something had shifted. Shut it down, Min-kyu said. Silence on the line. All of it, Min-kyu said. Everything. I want a plan by Friday. This will make enemies, Young-ho said. It already has. Another silence. Longer this time. Understood, Young-ho said. Min-kyu ended the call. He sat in his car outside her building until the light in her window went out. Then he drove toward a city that did not yet know it was about to lose its chairman, and began, in the dark and without ceremony, to become someone else. The first property sold in November. A logistics warehouse in Incheon, legitimate on paper, useful for other purposes for 11 years. The buyer was a regional freight company with no connections to anything that mattered. The transaction was clean. The paperwork was clean. The money moved into a holding account that Min-kyu's lawyer had established for the specific purpose of becoming something better than what it had been. Young-ho handled the details. He did not comment on them. This was how it began. The 6 months that followed did not look like a collapse from the outside. That had been intentional. Min-kyu had spent enough years understanding how power structures failed to know that the ones which fell loudest were the ones that moved carelessly, that announced their own endings through panic and speed and the particular visibility of men who had forgotten how to be subtle. He moved slowly, methodically, the way he approached a complicated surgery. One layer at a time, always knowing what was beneath before he cut. Routes suspended in sequence, not simultaneously. Distribution points dissolved into legitimate businesses that had been quietly built for exactly this transition. Financial accounts rerouted, laundered clean through legal channels, their origins buried in documentation that would take years to fully trace. 3 men who could not be trusted with what they knew were handled through Young-ho in ways Min-kyu did not ask to be detailed. By December, the Kang syndicate's eastern operations were functionally inactive. By January, the remainder existed only in obligation and paperwork. By February, it existed mostly in memory. Young-ho came to him in the 3rd month with the look of a man who had accepted something he disagreed with and intended to honor his acceptance without performing peace about it. 2 of the Busan families have made inquiries, he said. They're not threatening yet. They're watching. Let them watch, Min-kyu said. And when watching isn't enough for them, then we'll know who they are. Young-ho was quiet for a moment. You're giving up leverage. Every route we close, every property we sell, that's leverage gone. You're making yourself smaller on purpose. Yes, Min-kyu said. That's not something men in our position do. It's something I'm doing. Young-ho looked at him with the particular expression of a man recalibrating an understanding he had held for a long time. Then he nodded once, picked up the next file, and continued. Leila returned to Mirai Medical in January. Not to Min-kyu, she was clear about that in the way she was clear about most things. She requested a placement in the same intake unit with the same hours, managed by the same senior nurse who had processed her original transfer. She gave no explanation for her departure or her return, and nobody who understood her asked for one. She did not seek Min-kyu out. She saw him occasionally, in corridors, at the edge of briefings, once across the full length of the emergency bay during a complicated intake where their professional paths briefly intersected and then diverged again. He did not approach her. She did not approach him. But she watched. Not obviously. Not with the sustained attention that announces itself. The way a person watches something they are trying to understand from a safe enough distance that understanding it doesn't cost them anything yet. She watched him arrive at his shift without the particular tension she had learned to read in his posture, the tension of a man managing 2 weights simultaneously. She watched him stay late without disappearing afterward. She watched him take phone calls in the open instead of stepping away. She noticed that Jung-ho stopped appearing at the hospital entirely. She noticed that the black car had not been on her street in 2 months. She filed these things away without conclusion. The announcement came on a Thursday morning in March. Mirai Medical Center's board sent an internal communication to all staff. A new trauma center, funded by an anonymous private donation. Full wing. State equipment. Dedicated staff allocation. Construction to begin in April. Operational by the following year. The communication described it as the largest single private contribution in the hospital's history. The donor had requested no recognition, no naming rights, no plaque, no ceremony acknowledging the source. Leila read the announcement at the intake station between patients. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the middle distance for a moment. The same middle distance she had looked at with him in the cafeteria at dawn, after 6 hours of work and the first real conversation they had ever had. She knew. She didn't need evidence. She didn't need confirmation. The shape of it was too precise, too deliberate, too much like the way he did everything. Quietly, without announcement, making the thing real before anyone could argue about whether it was possible. She folded the communication and put it in her pocket. The opening ceremony for the trauma center's groundbreaking was scheduled for the first week of April. It was a hospital event, administrative staff, senior surgeons, a few board members, a local official who had agreed to say something brief. No press. The donor had requested no press. Leila received the invitation the same as every other senior intake staff member. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she accepted. The trauma center opened on a Thursday. It was a clean morning, the kind that arrives in early spring without announcement, where the light is different from the day before and the air carries something that isn't quite warmth yet but is moving in that direction. The kind of morning that feels like a decision the city has made. The ribbon was white. The building was modest from the outside, deliberately so, according to the architect's brief, which had specified functionality over spectacle with an insistence that the project manager had initially found unusual. Inside, it was something else. 12 trauma bays, a dedicated pediatric wing, staff-to-patient ratios that the nurses' union had described, in their formal response, as finally reasonable. The anonymous donor had been thorough. Leila arrived at 8 a.m. because that was when she arrived everywhere. Not early enough to perform punctuality, but early enough to understand a space before it filled with people. She walked the intake corridor first as habit, checked the supply stations, noted 2 things that needed adjusting and adjusted them without waiting to be asked. She was reviewing the triage board when she heard the room settle in the particular way rooms settle when someone enters who changes the weight of the air. She didn't turn around immediately. She finished the line she was reading. Then she turned. Min-kyu stood at the entrance of the intake corridor in a charcoal jacket and no white coat, which was how she understood immediately that he had not come as a physician. He had come as himself, or the version of himself that existed now, 6 months after a phone call at 2 a.m. that Jung-ho had told her about only recently, in the quiet way Jung-ho told her most things. Briefly, factually, and with the slight expression of a man who was still not entirely sure how to feel about the outcome. He looked different in sunlight. Not softer exactly, but less defended. The particular tension that had always lived at the edges of his composure, the cost of carrying 2 worlds in the same body, was absent. What remained was simply a man standing in a building he had built for reasons he had not publicly explained, looking at a woman he had almost not allowed himself to want. He walked toward her. The corridor was not empty. Staff moved around them with the careful peripheral awareness of people who sense something significant is happening and have decided to find reasons to be nearby. Min-kyu stopped in front of her. "You adjusted the supply station," he said. "It was wrong," she said. "It was set according to the original spec. The original spec was wrong." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The precursor to one. "I don't want power," he said quietly. The corridor noise continued around them, but his voice was calibrated only for her. "I've had it. I know what it costs and what it doesn't give back." He paused. "I want mornings. Ordinary ones. The kind where the hardest decision is whether the supply station is correctly positioned." Leila looked at him for a long moment. "It wasn't correctly positioned," she said. "No," he agreed. It wasn't. She looked down at his hand, which was at his side, open. Not reaching, not performing. Simply present. Available. The way he had learned to be, over 6 months of becoming someone who offered without demanding. She took it. Across the lobby, behind a cluster of hospital administrators posing for a photograph they would use in 3 separate press releases. Dae-ho stood with a visitor's badge and an expression he was working hard to keep neutral. He had heard about the trauma center through a former colleague. He had come, he told himself out of curiosity, to see what Leila had built herself into, to see if the version of her that had walked away from him had become someone he could have anticipated. He watched her take Min-kyu's hand. He watched Min-kyu look at her with the specific, unhurried attention of a man who has chosen something and closed every other door behind him. Dae-ho stood there for another moment. Then he removed his visitor's badge, placed it on the reception desk without speaking to anyone, and left through the main entrance into the ordinary Thursday morning, which continued without acknowledging his departure in any way at all. The hospital staff processed it slowly, the way people process things that reorder their understanding of a situation they thought they already understood. The junior nurses compared timelines in the break room. The senior administrator recalled, with new context, every moment Min-kyu had appeared in the intake corridor over the preceding months. A resident who had been present for the first corridor confrontation, stand behind the line like everyone else, told the story 3 times before noon and each time found it more coherent than before, as though the ending had made the beginning legible. By afternoon, it was simply known. Not announced. Not explained. Known the way things are known in places where people work closely and pay attention. At the end of the opening ceremony, when the administrators had given their speeches and the photographer had taken the last of his photographs and the corridor had emptied down to its working population, Leila and Min-kyu stood at the window at the end of the intake hall. Outside, the city moved through its Thursday. Traffic. People. The ordinary machinery of a place that did not know or require the details of what had happened inside this building over the past year. The light came through the glass at a low angle and sat on the floor between them. "You're still holding my hand," she said. "Yes," he said. "In a hospital corridor." "Yes." She considered this. "People will talk." "People have been talking," he said. "Since the first morning you told me to stand behind the line." She looked at him sideways. The small smile, the one that had ruined him in a break room at dawn 6 months ago, arrived again, unhurried and unguarded. He held her hand in the sunlight. And for the first time in the life of a man who had been raised in shadows and learned to move through darkness like it was his native language, the light asked nothing of him. It simply stayed. He thought about it sometimes. Not obsessively. Not with the circular, unresolved quality of regret. But the way you return occasionally to a specific moment in a long journey, not because you are lost, but because distance has made it possible to see the shape of the thing clearly for the first time. The corridor. The clipboard. Her voice, flat and unhurried. Stand behind the line like everyone else. He had spent 34 years being the line. Min-kyu was not a man given to reflection as a practice. Reflection required stillness, and stillness had always felt, in his previous life, like exposure. You kept moving in the world he had inherited. You made decisions and you absorbed their consequences and you did not sit with the weight of them longer than necessary because the weight of them, if you sat with it honestly, was considerable. But that life was over now. And in its absence, he had discovered that stillness was not exposure. It was just stillness. He was learning to inhabit it. What he understood now, what he could not have articulated in the warehouse, or in her kitchen with a wound at his side, or even on the morning he called Jung-ho and said shut it down, was that Leila had not saved him in the way of rescue narratives, where one person pulls another from the edge of something and receives credit for the outcome. It was quieter than that. She had simply refused to participate in the performance of him. Every person in his life, on both sides of it, had related to the version of him that held power. The surgeons deferred to his precision. The syndicate obeyed his authority. Even the women who had wanted him had wanted the constructed thing. The reputation, the composure, the carefully managed distance that read, from the outside, as depth. Leila had looked at him in a trauma corridor and seen a man blocking a hallway. And in that reduction, in being seen as nothing more and nothing less than a person taking up space he hadn't earned, something in him had shifted that he was only now able to name. She had made him want to be real, not powerful, not untouchable, not the surgeon on the billboard or the chairman in the warehouse. Real, with all the vulnerability that required, with all the risk of being known and found in the knowing to be someone worth staying for. That was what she had given him, not by trying to, but by refusing to give him anything false in return. Leila had her own accounting to do. She had believed, after Daeho, that she understood the taxonomy of dangerous men, that she could identify them by their patterns, the charm deployed too precisely, the future promised too fluently, the love that arrived pre-assembled and asked only for her surrender into it. Min-kyu had not fit the taxonomy. He had not promised her anything. He had asked for a seat at a table and then sat quietly and not asked for more. He had appeared in her corridor without demanding to be seen. He had told her the worst truth about himself and then stepped back and let her go, which was the one thing the men she had built her defenses against had never been willing to do. She had confused danger with power for a long time. They were not the same thing. Power could be put down. She had watched him put it down. Not cleanly, not without cost. Not in a single dramatic gesture but across 6 months of difficult, unglamorous, consequential work that no one had applauded because no one was meant to see it. That was not the behavior of a man who needed her to complete him. That was the behavior of a man who had decided to complete himself and wanted her to be present for the life that followed. She understood the difference now. Love, she had once believed, was something that arrived and rearranged you without your consent, that left you smaller than before, stripped of what you'd saved and trusted and built. She had worn that understanding like armor and called it wisdom. But armor and wisdom were not the same thing either. Choice was the word she returned to. He had given her that, every time without exception. Not a love that cornered her. Not a devotion that arrived with an invoice. A presence that remained available and asked each time to be accepted or refused on its own terms. She had chosen. She kept choosing. That, she decided, was what love actually was. Not the falling, not the rescue, not the grand gesture at the edge of ruin. The daily, undramatic, clear-eyed choosing of one person over the easier alternative of no one. The man who had once been desired by every woman in a hospital and felt nothing became a man who felt something every ordinary morning. In the specific way she held her coffee cup, in the particular silence she maintained until she was ready to speak, in the small smile that still arrived, still unhurried, still not given to anyone else. He did not take it for granted. He had learned, at significant cost, what it meant to be chosen by a woman who chose carefully. And so this is how it ended. Not with conquest. Not with a king claiming his prize. Not with the world rearranged around the force of one man's wanting. With a woman who had said no. Who had looked at everything the world considered desirable. The reputation, the power, the face on the billboard, the hands that performed miracles, and remained, at every stage, entirely herself. And a man who had understood, finally, that this was not rejection. It was the standard, and he had spent 6 months becoming someone who could meet it. The man everyone desired had chosen only one woman, the one who had refused him first, because the greatest love stories do not belong to those who are chosen without effort. They belong to those who are chosen after the truth, after the cost, after the asking has been made plain and the answer has been earned. Not by power, by transformation,